The dawn light, gentle and almost reverent, painted my vineyard with soft hues. Dewdrops shimmered on the Cabernet leaves like scattered fragments of glass, creating a scene of profound tranquility that only a man of considerable years truly appreciates. I was finishing some adjustments to the trellis wire on the south row, the dry earth yielding softly beneath my boots with a subtle crunch, when an anomaly broke the peaceful rhythm. Two figures, dark silhouettes against the emerging light, stood squarely in the heart of my vines, their posture suggesting an unwelcome claim of ownership. Initially, I considered them lost hikers or perhaps amateur ornithologists who had strayed from their intended path. However, their movements, sharp and deliberate as they navigated the rows, and the undeniable presence of handguns holstered at their hips, quickly dispelled that notion. Pausing, my hand on a sturdy post, I allowed my vision to fully adjust. They wore matching dark navy uniforms, neither clearly law enforcement nor private security, and their holsters, looking rather cheaply made, were positioned incorrectly. Even more peculiar was the patch adorning their sleeves, a small, printed pine tree above the words Lakeside Bluffs Community Enforcement Unit. The very idea of a community enforcement unit almost amused me, but a tightening in my jaw replaced any inclination to laugh. Lakeside Bluffs, the homeowners association these individuals represented, was situated a quarter-mile down the road. An enclave of meticulously manicured lawns, pastel-colored houses, and stringent regulations dictating everything from hedge height to garage door paint. My property, however, lay distinctly outside their jurisdiction, a fact that had never wavered and never would. I advanced, my footsteps a soft disturbance on the dirt, and the two men finally turned, as if just then becoming aware of my presence. One produced a clipboard, the other casually adjusted his belt, drawing my attention to his firearm, likely one he wasn't even authorized to carry. "Morning," the taller of the two announced, his sunglasses obscuring his eyes, his jawline sharp, and his hair cut in a severe military style. His stance, however, betrayed him. He leaned too far forward, his knees locked, projecting an air of manufactured confidence rather than genuine authority. "What are you doing on my land?" I inquired. The taller man offered a smile that suggested he believed his paperwork offered him an impenetrable shield. "Routine perimeter inspection," he stated. "Part of our HOA safety initiative." I let his words hang in the air like wisps of smoke. Then a quiet, genuine laugh escaped me. "This land isn't HOA," I clarified. "It never has been, and it never will be." The two men exchanged a look, not of embarrassment, but of shared understanding that the person before them perhaps didn't grasp the true nature of power dynamics. "Sir," the tall one continued, his tone laced with condescension, "your property borders the community that grants a secondary jurisdiction for safety reviews." I repeated his words. "Secondary jurisdiction? Is that the new term for trespassing?" His smile faltered. His companion stepped forward, pressing a button on his vest, ostensibly activating a body camera. However, the device was clearly off-brand, attached incorrectly, and its blinking red light indicated it was anything but recording. These men were not law enforcement. They were performers who had forgotten their lines. A primal instinct, long dormant, began to stir within me, the instinct of a former detective who had navigated rooms filled with fabricators, discerning who would make headlines and who would face justice. I offered no introduction, revealed no part of my past. It was unnecessary. I simply gestured towards the gravel drive. "Out!" I commanded, my voice firm. The tall man blinked, clearly taken aback by my lack of compliance with his fabricated authority. "Sir, refusal to cooperate could—" "Out!" I repeated, my voice sharper. He opened his mouth to speak again, but I took a deliberate step forward, a single, measured movement that signaled the end of our exchange. Both men hesitated, then finally turned and departed my property, muttering about documentation and non-compliance. They paused at the edge of the road, as if expecting me to look away. I did not, not until they were completely out of sight. I exhaled slowly. In my experience, trouble rarely announced itself with fanfare. It arrived subtly, with carefully orchestrated pleasantries and individuals posing as something they were not. As the sun climbed higher, warming the vineyard, a chilling premonition settled over me. Those two were not an isolated incident, but a harbinger, the initial tremor before a significant disturbance. I didn't anticipate encountering those pretenders again so soon, but trouble, it seems, prefers company. 2 days after their ill-advised visit, while I was securing a wooden brace near the main gate, the distinct sound of tires on gravel announced an arrival. The pace was slow, the weight heavy, too heavy for a standard sedan, too deliberate for a delivery vehicle. This left only one possibility: someone attempting to project an image of importance. I straightened, brushed the dust from my hands, and observed a weathered silver Tahoe slowly halt just beyond my property line. Its engine idled and the driver's door creaked open, a sound familiar to older SUVs that have endured countless seasons. A man emerged. He was tall, broad-shouldered, possessing the build of someone who had once been in peak physical condition and refused to acknowledge its decline. Aviator sunglasses shielded his eyes, and a faded sheriff's department patch, barely clinging to his jacket by a few threads, hinted at a past he couldn't quite relinquish. He didn't glance at the vineyard first, his gaze fixed on me, a deliberate assessment to determine whether intimidation or outright dominance would be the more effective approach. He approached the gate with a measured, heavy tread, his boots crunching on the dirt. Midway, I noticed a telling detail. His right hand hovered near his hip with every few steps. An ingrained habit, a cop's habit, but the way he held it was awkward, stiff, and rehearsed like an actor struggling to recall a role he had never truly mastered. "Morning," he stated, stopping short of the fence, his voice a gravelly rasp. I offered a nod. "Can I help you with something?" A thin, crooked smile, as if practiced in a rearview mirror, appeared. "Name's Greg Wallace. I'm the community enforcement captain for Lakeside Bluffs." I remained silent for a moment, allowing the title to resonate, to expose its inherent absurdity. "Community enforcement captain," I echoed, maintaining a neutral expression. "That sounds like something one might print on a business card." A slight twitch in his jaw betrayed my observation. I had clearly touched a nerve, revealing more than any introduction could have. He cleared his throat. "Your land borders our community. That places you under secondary HOA jurisdiction in the event of an emergency or safety concern." The word jurisdiction, again, the favorite refrain of men who had lost their legitimate authority. "My land isn't HOA," I stated calmly. "Not yours, not anyone's. It never has been." Greg leaned forward, his hand resting on the metal gate as if contemplating forcing his way through. "You're close enough," he asserted. "Close enough that what happens here affects us, which means I get to take a look around when I need to." I fixed my gaze on his hand on my gate, then met his obscured eyes. "That gate doesn't open for HOA fantasy titles," I declared. "Only for genuine law enforcement." His expression soured, his shoulders tensed. He straightened his jacket, a reflexive action from his patrol car days, but this time there was no badge, no authority, only muscle memory and a wounded ego. "Are you refusing an official safety inspection?" he challenged. "I'm refusing a man in knockoff authority gear pretending to have power on my land," I countered. For the first time, Greg pushed his sunglasses up onto his forehead, revealing pale, sharp, and intensely angry eyes. This was not the anger of the moment, but a deep-seated rage that predated his arrival on my property. I had encountered that look before, in interrogations, in interviews, on the faces of men who felt their authority slipping away and couldn't bear the loss. He exhaled through his nose. "Fine," he conceded. "But if something happens out here, anything. You remember I tried to keep things safe." "Safe for whom?" I inquired. He offered no reply, simply turned, walked back to his Tahoe, and entered without another word. The door slammed shut, The engine roared to life, and his tires spewed gravel as he sped away, a departure too hasty for someone merely asserting their presence. I remained by the gate for a long moment after he departed, my hands resting on the cool metal. I'd encountered my share of liars, bullies, manipulators, and wannabe heroes in my career. But Greg possessed a distinct quality, a disturbing instability lurking just beneath the surface. It wasn't mere ignorance or incompetence, it was something else entirely. A man stripped of genuine authority who had discovered a new arena in which to play the part. And I harbored a profound and unsettling certainty that Greg Wallace's interaction with me was far from over. Greg did not appear the following day. Men like him rarely needed a second invitation. They understood the power of lingering tension. 2 mornings after his peculiar visit, I was attending to a loose hinge on my workshop door when a sheriff's cruiser glided slowly up my driveway. The sight of an actual patrol car did not trouble me. Law enforcement had been on my property on numerous occasions over the years, typically for minor requests like a glass of water or a report about a misplaced pet. However, the manner in which this vehicle stopped, the way the officer disembarked with his shoulders already slumped and a look of apology already etched on his face, indicated this was no casual call. He adjusted his hat, cleared his throat, and stated, "We received a report about a possible weapons violation on the premises." I met his gaze for a moment. "On my premises?" He nodded, like a man entering a conversation he would rather avoid. "The caller stated there were firearms stored in plain view. Thought it might pose a risk to the neighborhood." I nearly inquired if the caller's name rhymed with Greg, but the officer already appeared sufficiently uncomfortable. Instead, I escorted him to the workshop and gestured towards the interior through the window. Against the far wall stood my secured, bolted steel gun cabinet, visible only from a specific angle outside and with a squint through the glass. The officer glanced inside. "Yeah," he muttered. "That's not a violation at all." "I know," I replied. He offered a sincere apology, promising to log it as a non-issue and expressing a hope that it wouldn't recur. It recurred, 48 hours later. This time, the complaint cited a strong odor of alcohol emanating into the neighborhood. A strong odor of alcohol. I reside on a vineyard where during the summer months the aroma of wine is practically airborne. The same officer appeared, even more apologetic than before. We stood together in the driveway, the gentle hum of bees and the quiet of the morning surrounding us as he ran a hand over his face as if trying to erase the embarrassment he felt on behalf of someone else. "Look," he said, his voice low. "I'm going to be direct with you. Somebody's messing with you." I nodded. "I have a pretty good idea who." He didn't ask for a name. He didn't need one. He departed slowly, his tires tracing long arcs in the dust. For a brief period, I entertained the possibility that this might be the extent of Greg's harassment, that the nuisance calls were merely his feeble attempt to provoke me, akin to a child throwing rocks at a fence to elicit a response from the dogs within. However, bullies, whether armed with a badge or a fabricated sense of authority, rarely limit themselves to mere provocations. They escalate. And the escalation began subtly, as trouble often does. I started noticing shadows where no shadows should be. Footprints near the property line, an unfamiliar HOA truck lingering too long down the road, neighbors walking their dogs, their paths inexplicably veering closer to my property, their gazes fixed on my house with an expression that was neither simple curiosity nor open friendliness, but rather a sense of having been fed a narrative, a story in which I was cast as the antagonist. Then the mail began. Folded flyers appeared in my mailbox, printed warnings about neighborhood safety concerns. One even alleged that my property was host to non-compliant agricultural operations. Non-compliant agricultural operations on a vineyard I had legally cultivated for years. I commenced documenting everything: photographs, timestamps, video recordings, an old professional habit resurfacing like a scar catching the light. Somewhere within me, a switch flipped. This was no longer random harassment. It was a deliberate, coordinated, and intentional campaign. Greg wasn't merely indulging a power trip, he was constructing a narrative, portraying me as a threat, a problem, an individual requiring management. Perhaps he believed the mounting pressure would force me to capitulate. Perhaps he thought a sufficient number of fabricated complaints would lead me to the HOA's doorstep, hat in hand, seeking a resolution. He did not understand me. He did not comprehend that I had spent years as a detective, listening to men weave elaborate tales designed to conceal their true intentions. Greg possessed that telltale look, the hallmark of someone exerting excessive effort to establish their version of reality. And when such individuals do not achieve the desired outcome, they do not retreat. They intensify their efforts. As I walked towards the fence line that evening, the sun descending behind the hills and the vines rustling softly in the breeze, I felt it with absolute certainty, a deep, cold conviction. Greg Wallace had only just begun, and his objective was control. He would not achieve it, but he was undeniably determined to try. I've always believed that each property possesses its own unique form of silence. Mine had once been characterized by the sigh of wind through the vines, the creak of aged wood, and the distant hum of cicadas. However, by the close of that week, an additional element permeated the quiet, a pervasive sense of being under surveillance. Not the overt watchfulness of someone standing at your fence, but a more insidious feeling, as if the land itself was being observed, and the observer was aware of being observed. I first noticed it on a Tuesday evening, just after sunset. The sky still held a faint band of amber along the ridge, and as I carried a coil of drip line back to the shed, something glinted in the fading light, a metallic flash high above. I stopped, tilting my head. There it was again, a tiny sparkle, like an errant star. But stars do not affix themselves to utility poles. I approached it deliberately, my boots crunching on the gravel, my breathing steady. Rage leads to carelessness, and legal battles drag on indefinitely. Closer inspection revealed a small, outdoor-rated bullet camera mounted at an unusually high elevation. Industrial screws secured it, and cabling was neatly stapled down the pole. On its side was a sticker bearing the familiar pine tree logo from those sham uniforms. Lakeside Bluffs Community Oversight Initiative. A laughable designation. I did not tamper with it. Instead, I scaled the fence rail, maintaining my balance, and held my phone aloft to capture the serial number etched into the bracket. Then I repositioned myself, photographing the wiring pathway. These were the tools of my former profession, the meticulous gathering of evidence. Clean, controlled, silent. On my return to the house, a gentle breeze stirred the western trees. A soft gust of air, and the leaves shifted just enough for me to perceive something else. A second camera, partially concealed within the branches, aimed directly at my porch. This one was an HOA-issue device, a different brand, smaller, less conspicuous, likely a private purchase. Greg's particular taste, no doubt. I had no doubt about who had installed it. The angle slightly downward, broad but not excessively so, was precisely how a man who had spent too many years pretending to be tactical would position a surveillance device. I stood beneath it for a full minute, motionless, staring directly into the lens, much like one would confront an adversary through a two-way mirror. I wanted whoever was on the other side to feel it, to feel me seeing them. A third camera appeared the following day, disguised within a cheap wildlife tracking shell. However, wildlife cameras are not typically aimed at patios. They are positioned to observe deer trails. This one was trained precisely on my morning coffee spot. In total, 5 cameras observed my property, 5 tiny points of amber light blinking in the darkness whenever I ventured outside. Consequently, I established a routine. Around 9 o'clock each evening, I would sit on the porch, a mug in hand. It mattered little whether it contained hot coffee or chilled wine. The ritual was the point. I sat erect, my expression serene, and simply looked at them. Most individuals fear being watched, but those who truly watch, those who engage in surveillance, detest being acknowledged. It shatters their illusion of power. By Thursday, I was convinced Greg was monitoring live feeds, somewhere perhaps from his garage, or maybe from a back room at the HOA office, where he indulged in his after-hours sheriff persona. Let him watch. Around midnight, after one of these silent confrontations, I retreated inside and accessed my router logs. An ingrained habit, a rekindled instinct. At first glance, everything appeared normal. My outdoor lighting system, my server, my phone. But buried within the list was a device with a MAC address I did not recognize. No label, no vendor identifier, simply a blank signature. It had connected for precisely 3 minutes at 2:14 in the morning, and the following night at 2:16, and the next at 2:13. A consistent pattern. Someone was probing, not yet attacking. Testing the doorknob before attempting to pry it open with a crowbar. I leaned back in my chair, the glow of the screen illuminating my face. Amateurs engage in spying out of curiosity. Professionals spy for control. And Greg was confused enough to believe he could embody both. The vineyard creaked in the wind outside, the vines brushing against each other like hushed whispers. Another night, another silent challenge. And somewhere in the darkness, behind a lens or a monitor, someone was watching. I closed the laptop softly. Let them watch, because the more they observed, the more they would reveal, and I was meticulously taking notes. The nature of pressure is that it rarely arrives as a sudden, forceful blow. More often than not, it begins with a gentle tap, or in my case, 2 distinct taps. I heard the first one early Saturday morning. I was near the arbor, trimming an overgrown branch, when the sound echoed from the front gate. It was light, polite, almost excessively so. I wiped my hands on my jeans and walked up the path. 2 individuals stood there, a man and a woman, each clad in the kind of pastel polo shirt that only HOA volunteers or real estate agents seem to believe conveys authority. They held clipboards, their smiles practiced, their feet planted just shy of crossing the property line. "Good morning," the woman chirped, enunciating each syllable as if auditioning for a commercial. "We're here conducting our routine environmental compliance review." Environmental compliance review. I almost inquired if they had taken a wrong turn on their way to the golf course. Instead, I rested my elbow on my gate and allowed the breeze to carry the silence for a few seconds longer than was comfortable. "This property," I stated finally, "is not part of Lakeside Bluffs." "Oh," she replied brightly, as if anticipating that response and having rehearsed her counter. "Yes, we're aware. However, due to adjacent ecological risk—" I raised a hand, interrupting her. "You have 5 seconds," I said calmly, "to step off my property line and keep walking." At 6 seconds, I stopped being polite. The man blinked. The woman swallowed. Both took a hasty step back, not even waiting for the 6th second to arrive. They retreated down the road with considerable speed, their pastel polo shirts fading into the distance like melting sherbet. But their presence was not the primary issue. They had not come to conduct any genuine inspection. They had arrived to probe the limits, to ascertain precisely how much pressure they could apply before I would resist. Their curiosity was satisfied. However, just as the wind's direction is never fixed indefinitely, the pressure from the Homeowners Association never originates from a singular vector. The second more insistent summons materialized that very afternoon. This time, it wasn't an imposition on my property line, but rather an assault on my personal tranquility. I had just settled in with a chilled glass of Sauvignon Blanc when that subtle shift in the atmospheric currents occurred once more. A dark shape momentarily obscured the sunlight on my porch. There was no preliminary rap, no polite salutation, simply an undeniable presence. And there he stood, Greg Wallace, occupying the public sidewalk like some stony sentinel, awaiting a license to unleash his ire. His arms were crossed, his jaw set rigidly, and he wore sunglasses, despite the sun having long since descended behind the distant hills. Initially, he remained silent. No verbal communication was necessary. He simply stood there, allowing me to perceive that he had observed the volunteers' hasty retreat, much like a commander surveying a battlefield, subsequent to reconnaissance reports. "Your demeanor," he finally articulated, "is creating complications." "For whom?" I inquired. "For the community." That community holds no claim over me. It impacts you directly. No, I corrected him. You are impacting me. This observation visibly agitated him, causing his nostrils to flare. A full, silent second elapsed. Then he advanced, still technically on public thoroughfare, yet close enough for me to detect the faint aroma of peppermint, presumably employed to mask the lingering scent of stale coffee. These inspections, he stated, will continue unabated until you exhibit compliance. I do not offer cooperation to trespassers. The choice is not yours to dictate. I elevated my glass slightly, a gesture akin to acknowledging the absurdity of his declaration. Greg, I addressed him softly. A man who believes he possesses authority is one matter. A man who needs authority, however, is an entirely different proposition. His jaw clamped shut. The remark had landed with a depth that clearly surprised him. Likely, it resonated with truth. He receded a step, gesturing towards my land, and proclaimed, "We will return, and the next encounter will not involve volunteers." He departed, his boots striking the pavement with a percussive finality. What he failed to notice, however, was that my attention was not fixed on his departure. Instead, I was observing his mobile device. The manner in which he repeatedly glanced at it, the way he angled it towards his torso to obscure the display, the precarious hover of his thumb just above the screen's edge, suggesting an exchange of real-time directives, it then became abundantly clear. Greg was not acting autonomously. He was not the architect of this plan. He was merely a pawn. Someone else was orchestrating the entire affair. An individual with a profounder grasp of bureaucratic mechanisms than Greg could ever hope to possess. Someone with something significant to safeguard. That dawning suspicion solidified into absolute certainty. That evening, upon checking my mailbox, I discovered, nestled perfectly within, precisely centered, a letter printed on substantial HOA stationery, complete with an embossed crest and gilded edging, bearing a signature at the bottom, Karen Manning, President of the HOA. The missive itself was a masterclass in veiled pronouncements. Owing to geographical proximity and escalating security concerns, your property has been provisionally designated within Lakeside Bluffs' expanded observation zone. Cooperative adherence is anticipated. Non-intrusive evaluations may be conducted as deemed necessary. To translate this jargon, we've arbitrarily established a perimeter. You're within it and we're coming. I did not rend the letter, nor did I utter an expletive, nor did I summon legal counsel. I simply folded it neatly, placed it in my file for evidence, and refilled my glass with another half portion of wine. Because now, the unvarnished truth was mine. Greg was not the tempest. He wasn't even the thunder. He was merely the harbinger, the wind that sweeps through just before the sky fissures open. And that rupture was imminent. The night that marked a definitive turning point was devoid of clamor. It was not characterized by violence, in fact. It began not with a sound, but with a shadow. A subtle distortion, barely a ripple across the eastern row of grapevines. I was in the process of securing the tool shed, my hand still on the lock, when my peripheral vision registered movement. A figure, crouched low, proceeding with an almost imperceptible caution that betrayed his belief in his own invisibility. I refrained from shouting, nor did I reach for the illumination controls. Years spent as a detective had instilled a singular principle. If an individual wishes to believe they are unobserved, permit them their illusion. They reveal far more when under that impression. By the time I reached the perimeter fence, the figure had vanished. He had undoubtedly slipped back over the ridge towards the main road. However, he had left a trace. Lodged halfway into the side panel of my external surveillance camera was a diminutive black USB drive. Constructed from inexpensive plastic, entirely unmarked, it was the sort of implement amateurs mistakenly believe professionals utilize. I refrained from direct contact. Extracting a pen from my pocket, I gently leveraged it free, allowing it to descend onto a clean serviette. Back within the confines of my residence, I activated my antiquated investigative laptop, a device conspicuously lacking a Wi-Fi adapter, Bluetooth connectivity, and any tolerance for malicious software. I inserted the USB drive. The data that materialized caused my jaw to clench, not from surprise, but from the confirmation it provided. Malware. Rudimentary, yet potent if one lacked the requisite insight. A program engineered to incapacitate local cameras, divert data streams to an external server, expunge existing recordings, and facilitate remote live access. It wasn't the product of a brilliant mind, merely an arrogant one. The digital signature of Greg was unmistakable, even in the absence of physical imprints. Most individuals in my predicament would have purged the data, reconfigured their systems, perhaps sought legal counsel. However, the surge of indignation can lead to imprudence, and legal proceedings are notoriously protracted. Consequently, rather than closing the door, I widened its aperture. At that precise moment, the bait for the trap began to take form. Uncomplicated, elegant, and perfectly calibrated. A snare, meticulously designed to ensnare Greg's inflated ego. If he sought incriminating evidence, I would furnish him with an irresistible pretext. I dedicated the subsequent morning to orchestrating the scene. I strategically positioned several crates near the rear of the shed, stacking them in a specific configuration. I enlisted the assistance of my Vineyard aide, Toby, to help load a couple of substantial sacks onto the tailgate of the truck. We conversed in hushed tones, sufficiently audible for a microphone potentially concealed within a compromised camera feed, yet sufficiently muted to convey an air of privacy. The sacks contained powdered yeast nutrients, indistinguishable from snow, high-grade organic fertilizer, and sealed containers of specialized winemaking reagents. Entirely legitimate, entirely innocuous, yet under specific lighting conditions, they bore the semblance of illicit contraband. Then, just as the sun began its descent, we enacted the scenario. I ensured the compromised camera offered an unimpeded vantage point. I stepped into the frame, lifted one of the sacks, and deliberately, in a seemingly casual manner, stated, "Ensure these are disposed of before dawn. We don't want any inquiries regarding that white powder." Toby grasped the implication instantly. A sharp young man, he nodded in agreement, playing along as if he'd performed such a charade numerous times. "Understood, boss. No one will be the wiser." "Excellent." I avoided any excessive dramatics. That is precisely where amateur schemes falter. Greg was not seeking a Hollywood production. He was searching for confirmation of a pre-existing narrative. A few overheard snippets, dim illumination, furtive movements. These are the irresistible lures for an individual of his disposition. Upon concluding our preparations, I secured the shed, extinguished the porch illumination, and allowed the surveillance equipment to assume its role. Approximately at midnight, the compromised feed reactivated. I had no need to witness the monitor from Greg's perspective. I could vividly picture his expression. Wide eyes, shallow respiration, his ego flaring like a festive illumination. The sudden surge of elation at the perceived discovery of something monumental. Greg craved a triumph. A significant one. Something that would momentarily restore his former status as a legitimate authority figure rather than a figurehead within the HOA, adorned with a counterfeit badge and a waning reputation. Therefore, I presented him with a fabricated crime, a meticulously staged transgression, and he fell for it, hook, line, and sinker. At precisely 12:43 a.m., my router's log registered a new connection, a foreign device accessing my internal network. It bore the identical MAC address signature observed on several preceding nights, but this time the connection persisted for an extended duration, 7 minutes, then 10, then 13. A man consumed by obsession. Finally, at 10:02 a.m., the connection terminated. I leaned back in my chair, allowing the ambient hum of the server to fill the room. The operation was complete. Greg had been presented with precisely the spectacle I intended. He would initiate his next move imminently, and it would be a precipitous one, because individuals like Greg, those who desperately crave authority after its forfeiture, do not engage in verification, do not perform double checks, do not engage in critical thought, they act. And when their actions lack foresight, they inadvertently step directly into the snare. My snare. The vineyard outside rustled gently in the nocturnal breeze. Somewhere within that darkness, 5 blinking lenses stared intently into the void, under the delusion that they were the pursuers. But the reality was straightforward. They were not observing me, they were performing for my benefit. Every subsequent action Greg undertook, he would do so with an inflated sense of confidence. And confidence is the most readily exploitable vulnerability. There exists a particular cadence of knocking that is wholly inappropriate during daylight hours, a nighttime summons, subtle, unsettling, designed not to instill fear, but to convey desperation. I detected it around 10:47 p.m., not at the main entrance nor on the porch, but at the side gate, the one rarely utilized except by those who are either disoriented or utterly desperate. I set aside my book, disengaged the safety latch on the porch illumination, and stepped outside. A figure stood just beyond the gate, one hand raised as if hesitant to lower it. A pastel HOA polo shirt, rapid breathing, his eyes darting nervously down the road. Travis. I had encountered him previously. The individual with the clipboard, in his mid-30s, invariably perspiring through his collar during HOA assemblies. The type of person who yearns for anonymity to such an extent that he achieves the opposite effect. He flinched as the porch light illuminated him. "Derek," he whispered, "can we converse?" I observed him for a moment. He harbored no intention of initiating a confrontation. His trembling was too pronounced for such a purpose. I opened the gate and gestured for him to enter. He stepped across the threshold as if traversing a border checkpoint. "What is transpiring?" I inquired. He wrung his hands. Genuinely wrung them, much like a student caught in an act of academic dishonesty. "They are overstepping," he declared. "Greg, Karen, the entire board." I crossed my arms. "Elaborate on overstepping." He swallowed with difficulty. "It involves surveillance," he stammered. "Far more extensive than you realize, and certainly more than the residents have been informed." He appeared as though he were forcing himself to expel a noxious substance. I maintained my silence, allowing him to proceed. Inaction often proves more effective than coercion. "Greg has been monitoring your property for weeks," he continued, his voice quivering. "Live feeds. He has an entire setup in his garage. Screens, documentation, case files. I witnessed it. I was not supposed to, but he neglected to fully secure the door when I delivered some documents." There it was, the initial fissure in their meticulously constructed facade. "What sort of files?" I pressed. "Everything," he whispered. "Schedules, screenshots from your cameras, activity logs, even notes regarding your visitors." I consciously regulated my breathing, though internally a cold apprehension tightened its grip. "And Karen?" I prompted. Travis cast a furtive glance around my porch, as if anticipating an ambush from the shadows. "She is aware," he divulged. "She feigns ignorance, but she knows. And Greg possesses leverage over her, something significant." He paused, his hand trembling at his side. "That is why I'm here." I did not press him for details. After a prolonged interval, he reached into his pocket and produced a folded piece of paper, creased and damp from perspiration. He extended it to me with both hands, as if handling a hazardous substance. I unfolded it deliberately. A password, a login URL, a cryptic note, internal cloud storage. Do not delete. I raised my gaze. He nodded with frantic urgency. "It belongs to Karen. The credentials she uses for HOA contracts, vendor proposals, private correspondence. There are files within that do not align with the official records. Discrepancies in funds, undocumented payments. Some of these directly implicate Greg." A chilling, silent moment passed between us. His sincerity was palpable. He lacked the audacity to fabricate such a complex falsehood. I folded the paper with meticulous care. "Travis," I began, "why confide this information to me?" His response was barely audible. "Because the others, they defer to Greg. They are intimidated by him, terrified of defying him, apprehensive of his potential actions given his hold over Karen." He hesitated, his throat constricting. "And you?" "I am apprehensive as well. However, I am more concerned about the trajectory of this situation. Greg is unstable, Derek. He speaks as if he still possesses a badge, As if he were the sheriff of some frontier territory, he perceives you as a threat, a danger to the community. I almost chuckled. I cultivate grapes, I stated. Travis shook his head vigorously. That is not how he interprets it. He asserts you are non-compliant, unpredictable, and potentially hazardous. He is meticulously constructing a case, a rationale. He desires an incident, something significant enough to legitimize intervention. He clenched his fists. And Karen will not obstruct him because he possesses leverage. Last year, she sanctioned vendor proposals that were illicit, involving duplicate payments and kickbacks. If that information surfaces, she forfeits everything. Consequently, she permits him to act with impunity. A gust of wind swept through the vineyard, rustling the leaves with a sound like a murmuring throng. I observed the man before me, drenched in perspiration, visibly terrified, struggling to maintain his composure. He was no paragon of virtue, nor even a man of exceptional courage. Yet tonight, his fear had propelled him towards candor. "What is it you desire from me?" I inquired. Travis blinked rapidly, as if he hadn't truly contemplated the question. "I want it to cease," he articulated. "I want someone to take action. And you are the sole individual Greg cannot intimidate." I exhaled slowly. "Travis," I said quietly, "you have just ventured into extremely perilous territory." He nodded. "I am aware." Another wave of wind swept through the vines. "You should return home," I advised. "Maintain a facade of normalcy. Do not engage in discourse with anyone. Not a syllable, not a hint." He swallowed with effort. "And Derek, yes, I was never here. You never encountered me." I held his gaze. "For your own well-being," I stated. "That is precisely how this transpired." He slipped through the side gate and vanished into the encroaching darkness, his footsteps rapid, almost frantic. I watched until the night consumed him entirely. Then I unfolded the paper once more. The password lay there, quiescent. A key, a confession, a spark awaiting ignition. Greg was not merely observing me. He was not solely engaging in harassment. He was fabricating a narrative. But now I held the initial thread that could unravel his entire intricate scheme, and I fully intended to pull it. I had experienced raids before, genuine incursions, federal warrants executed, drug busts. Those nights possessed a distinct rhythm, shouted directives, the thud of boots on pavement, the metallic clatter of equipment when adrenaline superseded caution. This particular raid bore no resemblance to any of those. It commenced with an unusual stillness, almost serene. I was hosting a modest evening barbecue, attended by precisely 12 individuals, all of whom were either friends or long-standing clients. They were enjoying ribs under the soft glow of the arbor lights, while blues music drifted gently from a nearby speaker. The vines rustled in the warm evening breeze. The fire pit crackled and glasses chimed. It was a pleasant evening, the sort that formed the cornerstone of my existence. Then the illumination arrived, alternating red and blue, casting a surreal glow over the vineyard as if the sky had suddenly begun to exhale lightning. 2 patrol cars appeared first, followed by a black tactical vehicle, its tires grinding down my driveway, churning up dust like a miniature gravel storm. The music ceased abruptly. Every conversation died with it. My guests instinctively recoiled, their hands raised slightly, their eyes wide with apprehension. I remained motionless, observing the vehicles come to a complete halt, watching the doors swing open, and witnessing the officers disembark, their hands hovering near their sidearms as if they had been briefed for a cartel operation. One young officer stepped forward, his voice betraying a tremor, just sufficient for me to discern it, even above the drone of the engines. "Sir," he stated, "we received a tip regarding illicit alcohol sales and potential narcotics activity on the premises." Behind him, the tactical vehicle's door slid open with haste, and there he was, Greg, standing with the self-importance of a man about to announce a promotion he had not earned. He pointed directly at me, shouting something to the officers that I could not quite decipher. He was likely attempting to assert command, to claim the raid as his own initiative, to bask in the spotlight he had perpetually craved. I raised my hands just enough to indicate my compliance. Then I spoke calmly. "Officer, unless your objective involves pulled pork and Merlot, you have been misinformed." My guests emitted nervous snorts, a mixture of apprehension and disbelief. However, the young officer was no longer the primary figure of consequence, because from the rear of the assembled group, pushing past two tactical operatives, emerged a familiar countenance, Andy Morales, intelligent, level-headed, the sort of law enforcement officer you would hope to encounter during a challenging late-night call. A man I trusted. His eyes surveyed the scene. My friends, the food, the wine, the conspicuous absence of any disarray. Then he saw me. "Derek," he exclaimed, "what in the blazes is going on?" "Inquire of your informant," I replied. Andy turned to the officer beside him. "Who logged the tip?" "Anonymous," the officer responded, "but it was transmitted through internal channels marked as priority." Andy's brow furrowed. He understood precisely what that designation implied. And at that very moment, Greg made his move. He lunged forward towards the cluster of covered barrels adjacent to my shed. Barrels I had deliberately positioned to serve as part of the honeypot surveillance trap 3 nights prior. Barrels that Greg had observed through the compromised feed facilitated by the malware his associates had infiltrated into my cameras. He shoved past 2 officers shouting, "It's in here! I saw him moving it! Open these damn bags!" "Greg, wait!" I commanded. It was too late. He retrieved a box cutter from his belt, plunged the blade into the uppermost section of the nearest canvas sack, and ripped downward with all his might. A voluminous cloud of fine white powder erupted, billowing directly into his face. It settled on his hair, his clothing, his open mouth. He stumbled backward, sputtering and coughing as if he had just inhaled an entire bakery. I stood with my arms crossed. "Be cautious, Greg," I stated calmly. "That is premium fermentation yeast. Inhale too much of that, and you might find yourself cultivating mold in areas you'd prefer not to discuss." A few officers struggled to suppress their amusement. Several failed. Greg frantically wiped at his face, smearing the white powder into streaks across his cheeks, resembling a deranged clown. Rage contorted his features. "Arrest him!" he shrieked, pointing at me with a trembling, powder-dusted hand. "He's concealing narcotics! I witnessed the footage! I saw it!" Andy stepped forward. "What footage?" Greg froze, but only momentarily. The footage from his property cameras." Andy stared at him with increased intensity. "Greg, how would you have gained access to his private security feed?" There was no response, only the palpable realization spreading across the faces of the officers. The silence grew thick enough to be cut. "That constitutes a felony, Greg." Andy's voice remained steady. It needed no amplification. "Quiet authority carries greater weight," Greg stammered, waving his hands in agitation. I had authorization. HOA oversight. Emergency jurisdiction." "No, you did not," Andy declared. 2 officers moved closer to Greg. Their posture was not aggressive, merely prepared. My guests observed, silent. The vineyard hissed faintly under the breeze. I stepped closer, lowering my voice sufficiently to be heard. "Greg, you have inadvertently walked into a trap." "My trap. The only illegal activity present tonight is you." The powder coating his face rendered him spectral, unhinged, defeated. Andy finally nodded to his men. "Apprehend him." And just like that, the self-proclaimed sheriff of Lakeside Bluffs, the man who believed he could intimidate, surveil, harass, manipulate, and control me, was escorted across my vineyard under actual police lights, his hands bound, resembling a powdered donut suffering from extreme anger issues. My guests began to breathe again. One of them whispered, "Holy hell!" I exhaled slowly. The trap had sprung cleanly, but I knew this was not the conclusion. Not yet. Greg was not operating in isolation, and the individual backing him was about to realize their own reckoning was approaching. News disseminates rapidly within a small community. Scandal travels even faster. By dawn, the entire populace of Lakeside Bluffs was aware that Greg Wallace had been led away in handcuffs, appearing as though he had been coated in confectioner's sugar. However, the precise reason remained elusive to them. They perceived it as a misunderstanding, an error. I intended to rectify that perception. I did not sleep that night. Instead, I occupied the hours between 2 a.m. and dawn, meticulously organizing the documentation Travis had provided, printing activity logs, highlighting inter-account transfers, and enlarging screenshots of Greg's illicit surveillance feed until they achieved poster-like proportions. At 8 o'clock on Main Street, I did not proceed to the police station. Instead, I positioned myself at the boundary of my property, precisely where the public roadway intersected with the HOA entrance. I established a simple folding table, a podium, and a placard bearing the inscription HOA Safety Update, The Truth. I extended invitations to 3 specific individuals: the editor of the County Gazette, the deputy sheriff who harbored a known animosity towards Greg, and Travis. Yet I was confident that others would gravitate towards the event organically, and indeed they did. Neighbors walking their dogs, joggers, passing motorists who slowed their vehicles to observe the unfolding scene. Within 20 minutes, I had amassed an assembly of approximately 40 individuals. I stepped forward. I dispensed with any amplification device. It was unnecessary. The palpable silence was sufficiently commanding. "Good morning," I began. "Most of you witnessed the lights last night. Most of you have heard the rumors." I picked up the initial poster board. It displayed a grainy, night vision photograph of a bedroom window. A collective gasp rippled through the assembled crowd. "This," I stated, gesturing to the photograph, "represents the primary sleeping quarters of the Miller household, situated 3 blocks away, captured 2 evenings prior." Mrs. Miller, positioned near the rear of the image, covered her mouth with her hand. "And this," I declared, flipping the display board, "is the exact time recorded by a concealed camera within the community's ancient oak, installed by Greg Wallace, funded by your homeowners association contributions." A low hum of discontent immediately arose, a mixture of indignation and astonishment. "Greg wasn't merely observing me," I continued, my voice escalating just enough to pierce the rising clamor. "He was scrutinizing you. He meticulously compiled dossiers on each of you, documenting visitors, departure times, and even your intimate relationships." I deposited a substantial pile of documents onto the table. Thud. "These are the detailed records, provided by an insider who could no longer tolerate the injustice." I noticed Travis in the assembled group, his head bowed, concealed by a hooded sweatshirt. He offered me the slightest of acknowledgments, but Greg was merely the enforcer, I elucidated. "Enforcement requires funding." I lifted the second collection of papers. Financial statements. Karen Manning. I enunciated the name distinctly. Across the street, within the confines of the HOA administrative office, I observed the window covering subtly shift. She was watching. Karen had approved security overtime expenditures amounting to $4,000 per month, directed to a consulting firm officially registered under Greg's spouse. She had also sanctioned upgrades to equipment, which were, in reality, kickbacks tied to vendor agreements. I held aloft the electronic correspondence. Here she is, in her own words, instructing Greg to, quote, "find incriminating information on the vintner so we can commandeer his property for the expansion." The crowd's disquiet had transformed into outright outcry. Individuals began to turn their gaze toward the HOA office, pointing, producing their mobile devices. "This is not a neighborhood," I proclaimed, my eyes fixed on the office window, knowing her presence behind it. "It's a personal treasury for a disgraced officer and a corrupt leader." I retreated from the speaking platform. "The sheriff is in possession of these files. The state prosecutor has these files, and now so do you." I left the accumulated papers on the table. By midday, 4 members of the board had submitted their resignations via electronic mail, citing a lack of awareness regarding the illicit operations. By 1 o'clock in the afternoon, a news crew from the metropolitan area had arrived. And by 3 o'clock in the afternoon, I witnessed Karen Manning hastily exit the rear entrance of the community center, loading cardboard containers into her vehicle's trunk under the cover of darkness. She presumed she could elude the unfolding consequences. She was mistaken. The snare had ensnared the rodent. Now, the hunt was for the mastermind. There exists a particular point in the diurnal cycle that seasoned wrongdoers dread above all others. It is not the midnight hour. Midnight is when they feel secure. Midnight is when the darkness is their dominion. No, the hour they truly fear is 5 o'clock in the morning, the hour of the wolf. The hour when slumber is at its deepest, defenses are at their lowest, and the judicial mandate is signed. We christened this endeavor Operation Aurora. I was not part of the contingent that converged on Greg's residence. I'm now a civilian. My identification is stored away, but I stood on my veranda, a mug of coffee in my hand, observing the procession of unmarked dark SUVs glide silently past my vineyard, turning left into Lakeside Bluffs. They withheld their sirens, at least for the moment. Andy contacted me 10 minutes later, providing the missing details. At precisely 5:14 a.m., the state attorney's specialized task force breached the front entryway of Greg Wallace's domicile. Greg did not offer any resistance. Despite his usual bravado, his pronouncements of tactical prowess, and his fabricated credentials, when the genuine tactical unit arrived, he capitulated. They discovered him in his hallway, attired in boxers and a soiled undershirt, attempting to force a data drive into a microwave oven. He failed to even activate the appliance before he was subdued on the floor, restrained with zip ties, and read his rights. However, the apprehension itself was not the most unsettling aspect. The subsequent search yielded the true horror. What they unearthed within that dwelling elevated this from a case of intimidation to a truly abysmal situation. In Greg's garage, his operational hub, they located the central server Travis had alerted me about. But it contained more than just activity logs. It was a meticulously crafted shrine. Numerous display screens, storage devices meticulously labeled with street addresses, and affixed to the wall, a vast map stretching from floor to ceiling depicting Lakeside Bluffs and its environs. Color-coded markers indicated each dwelling: blue for compliant residents, yellow for those on a surveillance roster, and precisely at the center, encompassing my vineyard, was a thick crimson demarcation line. Within the confines of this circle, he had scrawled a solitary word: target. But the depravity did not end there. Tucked away within the master bedroom closet, they discovered an arsenal that would make a cartel founder nervous. 3 AR-15 style rifles with serial numbers deliberately obliterated, a modified electroshock device illegally amplified to a perilous voltage, and a container filled with plastic restraints, specifically flex cuffs, sufficient to immobilize a dozen individuals. He was not merely role-playing as a law enforcement officer, he was actively preparing for a conflict that existed solely within the confines of his own troubled psyche. Had I not engineered that trap, had I not precipitated his reaction prematurely, heaven only knows what he might have inflicted with those restraints. While the task force systematically dismantled Greg's existence, a separate team was actively pursuing the architect, Karen Manning. She had not returned to her residence following the public revelation. She had fled. However, individuals like Karen, those who have spent their entire existence ensconced in a protective bubble of petty authority, are incapable of vanishing. They lack the knowledge to discard a communication device, to switch vehicles, or to evade digital tracking. They succumb to panic. At 6:45 a.m., a state patrol officer observed a high-end Lexus traveling at excessive speed on the interstate, approximately 50 miles shy of the state border. Upon initiating a stop, she did not attempt to evade. Instead, she secured the vehicle's doors and began to scream. She vociferously declared her position as the association's president. She shrieked that this was an elaborate conspiracy. Her screams continued unabated until the vehicle's windows were shattered and she was forcibly removed. Within the trunk, they discovered 2 pieces of luggage. One contained apparel, the other was laden with $140,000 in currency, funds siphoned from the Homeowners Association's Emergency Repair Reserve mere hours before the accounts were frozen. By 9 o'clock in the morning, the sun had fully ascended above my vineyard. The convoy of SUVs had departed. The wail of sirens had faded into silence. My mobile device vibrated. A text message from Andy, concise and professional. Both apprehended, evidence secured. The matter is concluded. I gazed out at the orderly rows of vines, stretching, verdant and tranquil, towards the distant horizon. The morning dew glistened on the leaves. Avian life filled the air with song. The watchers were gone. The surveillance devices were deactivated. The oppressive shadow that had loomed over my property for weeks had finally completely dissipated. I took a draught of my coffee. It possessed a flavor I hadn't experienced in years. Yet I was aware that one final act remained. An apprehension is merely the commencement. The true conclusion unfolds within the courtroom, and my intention was to occupy a prominent seat. Courtrooms possess a distinct olfactory signature: floor polish, aged timber, and the distinct aroma of apprehensive perspiration. It's a scent I hadn't encountered in an extended period. However, upon entering the County Superior Courthouse on that Tuesday morning, it felt akin to donning a cherished worn garment, substantial and familiar. The legal proceedings spanned 3 weeks. 3 weeks dedicated to jury selection. 3 weeks of highly compensated defense attorneys attempting to portray Greg Wallace as an overly zealous community protector and Karen Manning as an unfortunate victim of circumstance. They endeavored to frame the proceedings around property boundaries. They attempted to steer the narrative towards zoning regulations, but one cannot dispute tangible video evidence. On the 4th day of the trial, the prosecution presented the recorded footage from the honeypot operation. The courtroom fell into a profound silence as the jury observed Greg on the expansive projection screens. They witnessed his stealthy movement through the darkness. They observed his unlawful entry onto private property. They saw him compromising a private digital system. However, the definitive blow was not the video itself. It was the accompanying audio. Travis, his voice tinged with nervousness and a tremor, took the witness stand and presented the audio recordings. The jury listened intently as Greg's voice, captured within his own garage, boasted to an acquaintance during a telephone conversation. "Once I plant the evidence," his voice was heard stating, "the winemaker is finished. Then we seize the land. Karen has a buyer already lined up for the expansion." Audible gasps rippled through the spectators' gallery. I remained in the front row, observing Greg's posture from behind. He did not turn. His shoulders were noticeably slumped. The arrogance that had previously defined him had vanished, replaced by the diminished demeanor of a bully who finally comprehends that authority is now observing. Karen refused to make eye contact with anyone. She fixated on her hands, weeping silently, attempting to embody the role of a fragile elderly woman. This facade proved ineffective, especially after the forensic accountant testified, meticulously detailing the provenance of $40,000 in cash. The funds had been diverted from the neighborhood's roof repair allocation, from the budget designated for playground maintenance, and directly from the pockets of the very individuals seated behind me in the courtroom. When my turn arrived to provide testimony, I avoided looking at the defendants. My gaze was directed at the jury. I recounted the presence of surveillance drones, the covert cameras, the pervasive intimidation tactics, and the palpable fear my neighbors experienced upon witnessing a counterfeit police vehicle parked outside their residences at the midnight hour. "A domicile is intended to be a sanctuary," I conveyed to them. These two individuals transformed it into a correctional facility. The jury deliberated for less than 4 hours. Upon their return, the atmosphere in the chamber felt charged with anticipation, a heavy, static silence preceding an electrical discharge. The judge, a woman of stern demeanor with absolutely no tolerance for the abuse of authority, formally requested the verdict from the foreman. I observed Greg. He was visibly trembling, an undeniable tremor. On the charge of conspiracy to commit extortion, guilty. On the charge of aggravated stalking, guilty. On the charge of possession of unregistered firearms and the modification of weaponry, guilty. The litany of accusations continued, 18 counts in total. Subsequently, the sentencing phase commenced. The judge peered over her spectacles at Greg Wallace. "Mr. Wallace," she pronounced, her voice slicing through the room with surgical precision. "You once took an oath of service as a law enforcement officer, and you betrayed that trust. You then constructed an illusory world where you could reenact that abuse of power. You terrorized this community not for the purpose of ensuring safety, but for the gratification of your ego. I sentence you to 24 years in federal prison with no possibility of parole. Greg's knees buckled. His legal counsel had to support him. He emitted a sound, a peculiar blend of a sob and a gasp that reverberated off the lofty ceilings. The judge then turned her attention to Karen. "Mrs. Manning," she stated, "you were entrusted with the guardianship of this community. Instead, you treated it as your personal financial repository. You financed a clandestine paramilitary operation to harass an innocent individual. I sentence you to 18 years. Furthermore, you are hereby ordered to provide full restitution in the amount of $450,000 to the HOA funds." Karen emitted a wail. It was a piercing, unpleasant sound, the auditory manifestation of a life of privilege shattering against an unyielding concrete barrier. However, the judge had not concluded. She struck her gavel once, commanding silence throughout the chamber, and then addressed the remaining members of the HOA board present in the gallery. "Furthermore," she declared, "evidence presented has definitively established that the Lakeside Bluffs Homeowners Association has devolved into a criminal enterprise. By decree of this court, the current board is hereby dissolved with immediate effect. An impartial administrator will be appointed to oversee the community's affairs until equitable and properly monitored elections can be conducted." The courtroom erupted, not with anger, but with a wave of applause, genuine, sustained applause. My neighbors, individuals with whom I had exchanged minimal pleasantries for years, embraced one another. Some wept openly. The epoch of terror had officially concluded. I stood, buttoned my jacket, and proceeded into the adjoining corridor. Andy was awaiting my arrival. He offered no smile. He simply inclined his head. "Justice?" he inquired. I glanced back towards the imposing oak doors through which bailiffs were escorting Greg and Karen towards their newly designated lives within cells measuring 6 by 8 feet. "Yes," I replied. "Justice." We exited the courthouse together, stepping out into the brilliant, warm afternoon sunlight. The atmosphere outside felt qualitatively different, cleaner, more buoyant. It possessed the invigorating taste of liberation. 6 months elapsed, and the tranquility returned to the vineyard. However, this was not the oppressive, watchful silence of prior times. It was the serene silence of flourishing growth, the quietude of wind rustling through abundant vines, the stillness of a hawk circling high overhead, its gaze fixed on its prey, not on potential leverage. I dedicated the morning of the Harvest Festival to patrolling the property's perimeter. The expanded surveillance zone had been dismantled. The cameras concealed within the trees were gone. I personally removed the final device, discarding it into the recycling receptacle, and watched as the waste management vehicle compressed it into a heap of discarded plastic. The surveillance drones no longer traverse the skies. The neighborhood itself has undergone a transformation. With the king and queen of Lakeside Bluffs incarcerated in federal facilities, the pervasive sense of fear has evaporated. Now, people offer genuine waves, not the apprehensive gestures of individuals constantly assessing who might be observing. Travis has been elected the new president of the HOA. He was reluctant to accept the position. He attempted to abscond when his nomination was put forth. However, that very reluctance is precisely what makes him an ideal candidate. He dissolved the enforcement committee on his inaugural day. Now the HOA focuses on its designated responsibilities, such as swimming pool upkeep and the beautification of flower beds. I reached the main entrance, the identical gateway where Greg had once stood, demanding my subservience. I affixed a new sign to the wooden post, crafted from robust oak with brass lettering. I fashioned it myself. It reads, "Private property, cameras actively recording, sheriff appointments only, HOA jurisdiction ceases beyond this point." I stepped back to admire my handiwork. It was not a threat. It was a declaration of fact. By dusk, the tables were arranged beneath the vine-covered arbor. This time, there were no flashing emergency lights, no tactical vehicles, no frantic individuals covered in yeast, merely companions, fellow residents, and even a few individuals who had previously hesitated to even cast a glance in the direction of my residence. The aroma of slow-roasted pork and smoldering wood permeated the air. Bottles of my finest reserve Cabernet were being opened. The sound of joyous laughter, loud and unfeigned, ascended towards the star-filled sky. Andy Morales was present, off duty, a beverage in hand, engaged in conversation with Travis about some amusing anecdote. I observed them from the periphery of the patio. A young couple from the neighborhood approached me. They were holding glasses filled with my wine. "We simply wanted to express our gratitude," the woman conveyed, for standing up to them. "We genuinely didn't believe anyone could stop them." I offered a smile. "Vines have deep root systems," I explained. "They do not relinquish their hold easily." As the evening progressed and the bonfire dwindled to glowing embers, I tapped a spoon against my wine glass. The surrounding chatter subsided. 50 faces turned in my direction. I raised my glass. The deep crimson wine, catching the firelight, shimmered like a precious ruby. I surveyed the land I cherished. I looked upon the individuals who were finally free to interact as neighbors once more. "To freedom," I proclaimed, my voice carrying clearly into the quiet night. "To established boundaries." I paused, my gaze drifting towards the deserted road where Greg's imposing SUV had once patrolled. "And to the absolute satisfaction of preventing small men from assuming the roles of authoritative figures." "Hear, hear," Andy exclaimed. Glasses clinked together, the sound resonating like a melodic bell. I took a sip. It was the finest vintage I had ever produced. It tasted undeniably of victory.